We're here again with Chief Mark McBride, and we're going to talk about use of force, because that's especially been in the news a lot lately. We just recently had an officer-involved shooting back in June. There's obviously a number of different things going on in the public arena regarding officers and use of force and everything. So, first question I have for you, Chief McBride, is what does use of force mean?
Well, first off, thank you for the opportunity to address this use of force for the community and those members of the community that are going to view this video. I appreciate that. But what does use of force mean? When officers are confronted with a situation, they have to determine what level of force or what means they need to use to bring a person within the purview of the courts. So force might be simply putting your hands on a person to arrest them. If the person resists, that causes us to create or use greater force. So it's affecting an arrest is what that amounts to, and how we need to go about that. We're bound by the Constitution to bring offenders under the purview of the courts, and we have the authority to use the force necessary to make that happen. But it has to be governed by, again, the Constitution and Supreme Court rules that we have to consider as we're making those decisions on what force to use.
So what are the types of use of force that people might normally see? Obviously, you said use of hands.
Yeah, most conversations or interaction with the public is simply a verbal conversation, and sometimes it results in a citation. Very good conversations throughout the nation. I think it's less than 1% of the arrests that there's actually force used, and so that comes to a person resisting, not following the direction of the law enforcement officer. And so then it becomes a hands-on situation. If that arrest is resisted in any manner, whether it's pulling away or they produce some sort of weapon, something that's a threat to the officer or the community, then that force escalates, which could be anything from OC spray to a baton, a taser. Certain situations, there's what's called beanbag rounds, and ultimately lethal force could be used, which is the firing of a handgun usually.
So really, I mean, you said less than 1% really see that escalation of use of force. So really, probably most day-to-day officers really aren't going to be using a lot of use of force on their.
That's correct. We have about 3,000 arrest situations a year here in the Idaho Falls Police Department. But that also includes misdemeanor citations where it's cite and release. So those are all considered arrests under our reporting system. So out of those 3,000 contacts alone, that's very minimal use of force, less than 1% usually.
And obviously, this, the determination of if they use force or if it escalates into force, comes back to training. So how do you handle, how are officers trained to handle such situations and to determine what types of use of force is appropriate for the situation?
Well, the how in training an officer on the use of force is before an officer ever goes on the street, even with their training officer, we hold what we call in-house academy. And we talk about use of force because it's not fair to those officers or the community to have an officer out on the street that has no training in that. And so we teach them through scenario-based training, teach them the basic information. The Supreme Court rulings, Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, being free from search and seizure by the government. So we talk about those things, and then we have scenario-based training, and then ultimately they go to the police academy, that's called POST, and they give them further training, and then annually we have training that helps officers understand, keep updated on use of force, latest Supreme Court or court decisions, and we also get almost monthly decisions made by the courts that deal with force and use of force that would be reviewed by officers. So it's a lot of conversation in understanding the rules, applying the rules, the laws, And then it's application through scenario-based training, in which the different tools that are used for force application are then practiced. But that also includes the de-escalation of force. So the officer, we try to teach them that, you know, this level of resistance may justify the use of force of some sort, lethal, but in some situations you may be able to de-escalate it so that you don't have to use that force.
And then, just kind of going off of that, about how much, you said that they receive annual training, so what is that in by numbers? I mean, is that something that is, I know that there are a certain amount of hours that are required by officers to maintain their post-certification. You know, how many hours is that, and then how many of hours are included in that directly deal with use of force issues?
It varies a little bit year by year, but the state police academy requires a minimum of 20 hours a year of training for officers. That's all training. Typically, the Idaho Falls Police Department engages in approximately 60 hours per individual a year. And that does include use of force training. So how many hours, I haven't calculated that out, but there's probably at least, throughout the year, probably at least 20 hours. And the reason why I say that is because every tool you train in, when you go out to the firing range to shoot, that training also includes use of force training and decision-making skills, besides just how to shoot a gun or how to hit a target. So, you know, we're out to the range 4 times a year for most officers. SWAT teams out there every month, because when they're called upon, they're in more serious situations. But on an average, I'd say we're probably engaged in at least probably 20 hours a year in some sort of use of force training.
And as a department, I mean, well, even as an administration, you know, how do you prioritize use of force training compared to some of the other training aspects of police work?
Well, in training, you look at your high liability, high risk situations that don't occur as often. You need to train more on those so that those decision-making skills are there, so when they're confronted with those situations, that they can make those decisions. Or if it's a low-impact situation, not as serious, you need to train, but you don't have to train as often because they're doing having those confrontations or on a more regular basis, so they're practicing those on a regular basis. But use of force, like, you know, being less than 1%. That needs to be trained quite a bit so we can make those decisions, those split-second decisions, because they're never, or very seldom are they such that you can sit back and analyze it for minutes or hours to determine the level of force needed.